Picture the most dangerous criminal in your town. Now picture him finishing his homework at the kitchen table while his mom cooks dinner in the next room. Picture her calling out, "Caleb, have you eaten?" And him calling back, "Yes, Mom." And the smell of pasta sauce on the stove, and everything about that house feeling completely, perfectly ordinary. Now picture that at that exact moment, 3 counties away, a detective named Ray Falcott is pinning a photograph to a corkboard. He has been running a case for 7 months. He has 17 documented incidents tied to this case. Arson, coordinated robbery, the organized intimidation of an entire neighborhood, and 1 death that the medical examiner cannot fully rule accidental. And the photograph on Ray Falcott's board? It's a school photo. Blue background, slightly lopsided tie. The kind of photo every school in America takes in September that kids hate and parents keep forever. The boy in that photo is 12 years old. His name is Caleb Morrow. He lives on Birchwood Lane in Cartmel, Ohio. He gets BS and CS in school. His mother, Diane, is a home care nurse who works 40 hours a week and believes, with every cell in her exhausted, devoted body, that she knows exactly who her son is. She has never been more wrong about anything in her life. Welcome back, you sharp-eyed, truth-hungry investigators. I'm James, and this is Uncanny Crime Stories. Get comfortable, because today we are going somewhere that true crime almost never goes, not into the mind of an adult who made a terrible choice, but into the space between a mother's absolute certainty and the truth her child was hiding inside it. This one stayed with me for a long time. I think it'll stay with you too. Let's go. Cartmel, Ohio. Population 6,400. Cartmel is the kind of Ohio town that shows up on lists of places people are from rather than places people go to. It sits about 40 minutes south of Columbus in a part of the state where the soybean fields go on long enough that you start to forget cities exist. There's a Walmart, a shuttered cinema, 2 churches, and a diner called Marceline's that makes the best biscuits and gravy in 3 counties, according to a sign that has been outside Marceline's since 1987. It is not a wealthy town. It is not a dangerous town. It is the kind of town where people leave their cars unlocked and know their neighbors' names and assume, the way people in quiet places are allowed to assume, that the worst things happen somewhere else. Diane Morrow moved there in 2009 when Caleb was 4 years old, after her marriage ended. Her ex-husband, Kevin, moved to Pittsburgh. She stayed because she had a job at the Cartmel Residential Care Center, and because the rent on Birchwood Lane was something she could actually manage on a nurse's salary, and because she had grown up in a small town herself and believed, correctly, that they were better places for a child than she could afford in Columbus. She was raising Caleb alone. That is the first thing you need to understand about Diane. Not because single mothers are to blame when something goes wrong with their children. They are not, and anyone who suggests otherwise can see themselves out. But because the particular texture of their life on Birchwood Lane was shaped by it. Diane worked. Diane came home. Diane cooked and helped with homework and watched TV on the couch with Caleb on Friday night. She drove him to his baseball games and his dentist appointments, and she read every progress report from school even when the news in them wasn't great. She was present. She was devoted. She was doing everything right. And she was, without knowing it, alone in the house with a stranger. Caleb Morrow at 12 was a particular kind of child that adults often misread. He was not loud. He did not throw tantrums or pick fights at school or set off alarm bells in the way that children in difficulty sometimes do, which is to say, conspicuously, loudly, in ways that force the system to pay attention. He was quiet, internally organized. He had a flat, watchful quality that his teachers noted in a vague way, smart but doesn't apply himself, capable but seems elsewhere, without ever quite identifying what the something elsewhere actually was. Diane saw a child who needed space, who was a bit of an introvert like his dad, who had taken the divorce hard in the quiet internal way that quiet children do. She gave him that space. She respected it. She knocked before entering his room. She let him have a laptop for homework without monitoring it closely after he turned 10, because she believed in trust, and because she was tired, and because the school had said he was doing fine. She did not know what was on that laptop. She did not know about the phone. A prepaid device, bought with cash from a petrol station 4 towns over, that lived behind a loose section of baseboard in the back of Caleb's wardrobe. She did not know about the group. The group, what investigators would later call the Birchwood Network. The first thing you need to understand about how Caleb Morrow operated is that he did not do any of this alone. A 12-year-old cannot run a multi-county criminal operation, not alone, not without older participants, not without a structure that someone smarter and more experienced than a 12-year-old had to have provided. Investigators would spend considerable time unpacking that structure, and what they found was genuinely disturbing in ways that go beyond the crimes themselves. But it was also clear, undeniably, uncomfortably clear, that at the center of that structure was a child. Not a patsy, not simply a lookout or a tool. A child who had understood the operation, contributed to its planning, and in several key instances directed it. Detective Ray Falcott, looking at 7 months of evidence, would describe it like this. The older members provided the muscle and the resources. But the architecture, the way targets were chosen, the timing, the communications protocol, a lot of that came from the boy. The question everyone would eventually ask, and never satisfactorily answer, was how. How does a 12-year-old in a small Ohio town, with a loving mother who is home most nights, develop both the capacity and the opportunity to do this? The answer begins 2 years earlier, in the summer Caleb turned 10, when a family moved in 3 houses down from Birchwood Lane, and their eldest son, Tyler Reck, 22 years old and recently released from a county corrections facility, started paying attention to the quiet, intelligent boy who sat on the curb and watched the street. Tyler Reck, the catalyst. Tyler Reck was not a mastermind. He was not sophisticated, not particularly intelligent, and had the kind of impulsive criminal history, petty theft, vandalism, 2 counts of aggravated trespass, that suggested a person who acted on opportunity rather than plan. He had served 8 months in the Hocking County Jail and come out unchanged in the specific way that short sentences and zero rehabilitation produce. What Tyler had, though, was time. He wasn't working. He wasn't going anywhere, and he found the small, watchful, clearly bright 10-year-old on the curb interesting in the way that certain adults with no business being interested, sometimes find children interesting. Not in a predatory sexual way. Tyler Reck's interest was different and in some ways more insidious. He saw, in a child who was clearly underestimated by the adults around him, something he could use. He started talking to Caleb. Casually at first, about nothing, about cars, about sports. He treated Caleb like an equal, like an adult, in a way that adults who have authority over children rarely do, and which certain children, especially those who feel unseen, find intoxicating. Within 6 months, Caleb was spending most of his after-school hours at the rec house. Diane knew Tyler's mother, Carol, vaguely. Carol seemed fine. The house seemed fine. Caleb seemed, actually, Diane noted, happier, more purposeful, more animated. She did not know what he was animated about. Tonal break number 1. 11 to 12 o'clock. Pause button breathing break. Necessary pause before we go deeper. Conversational, direct, honest. Lean back. Change energy. Talk to the audience like a friend pausing a difficult conversation. I want to stop here for a second and acknowledge something that I think is important, and that we don't always do well in true crime. When a child is involved in a story like this, not as a victim but as a perpetrator, our instinct is to go one of 2 directions. Either we make the child a monster, some aberration of nature that has nothing to do with the world around them, or we go so far in the other direction that we flatten the real harm that was caused to real people. I'm not going to do either of those things today. Caleb Morrow made choices. Real choices with real consequences that fell on real people. That's true and it matters, and we're going to talk about it fully. But he was also 12 years old. And he was also found and groomed by an adult who understood exactly what he was doing and was never going to face the same consequences for it. Both of those things are true simultaneously. That's what makes this story so difficult. That's exactly why we need to tell it clearly. Alright, let's keep going. It started with information. The operation, and investigators did eventually call it that, with the kind of reluctant precision that comes from having to describe something in court documents, began as something that would have seemed almost innocent if you didn't know what it was feeding into. Caleb gathered information. He walked Cartmill with a 10-year-old's invisibility. Children are the most overlooked people on earth in places they're supposed to be. No adult looks twice at a kid on a bicycle, a kid cutting through a car park, a kid waiting outside a shop. Caleb used that. He noted which houses had dogs and which didn't. Which families left for work at 7:30 and came back at 6. Which neighbors collected packages on the step for 2 or 3 days before bringing them in. Which properties had security cameras pointing at what, and which cameras were the cheap cosmetic kind that no one ever checked. He kept notes, handwritten, in a notebook that looked like a school exercise book, and which Diane occasionally saw on his desk and thought nothing of. The notes were in a shorthand that he and Tyler had developed, abbreviated further. That would take investigators nearly 2 weeks to fully decode. This information went to Tyler. Tyler fed it to 2 older men in their late 20s, Marcus Webb and Dean Fulcher, who had criminal records and connections and no interest in doing their own legwork. They paid Tyler. Tyler paid Caleb in cash, in small amounts, which Caleb kept in an envelope taped to the underside of his desk drawer. By the time investigators found it, there was just under $400 inside. $400. The going rate, apparently, for 7 months of intelligence work that facilitated 17 criminal incidents across 3 Ohio counties. The first 6 months were reconnaissance. From month 7 onward, Caleb's role changed. He began participating directly in what investigators classified as coordinated property crimes, break-ins to commercial properties after hours, targeting businesses in small towns where response times were slow and security was minimal. Caleb would identify the target, map the entry and exit, and on 3 documented occasions was physically present during the break-in itself, acting as lookout, positioned on a bicycle 2 blocks away with the prepaid phone, watching for police patrols. He was, in these moments, a child on a bicycle in the dark. And he was also a critical operational component of a criminal enterprise. He was home by 11. Diane was usually asleep. She worked the 6 a.m. shift. Investigators would later trace his movements on 6 separate nights through a combination of cell tower data from the prepaid phone and CCTV footage from petrol stations and traffic cameras along the relevant route. On every one of those 6 nights, Diane Morrow's car was in the driveway on Birchwood Lane. She did not drive him. She did not know he left. He got himself there. On a bicycle, in the dark, in rural Ohio, at the age of 11 and 12. On the 14th of February, in the town of Reedsville, population 923 miles from Cartmill, a commercial warehouse on the edge of town was set alight. The building belonged to a man named Harold Spears, who had operated a storage and logistics business from it for 11 years. The fire began at approximately 2 a.m. It moved quickly, faster than initial investigators expected, through a building that turned out to be improperly sprinklered and stacked with materials that had no business being stored in proximity to each other. The Reedsville Volunteer Fire Department, working with understaffed and aging equipment, contained it by 4:30. Harold Spears lost the building, the contents, and 11 years of records. His insurance paid out partially on a contested claim that took a further 8 months. He has not rebuilt. The fire was set deliberately. Accelerant traces found by the State Fire Marshal's office confirmed it within 72 hours. What had not been accounted for? What Tyler Reck had known and not mentioned, and what Caleb had not known at all, was that the warehouse had a night watchman. An older man named Chester Price, 67, who worked 2 nights a week for a flat fee of $40 a night because his pension wasn't covering his costs and he liked the quiet hours. Chester Price was found by firefighters in the south corner of the building. He had smoke inhalation injuries that put him in Reedsville General Hospital for 9 days. He was discharged with permanent reduced lung capacity. He cannot work now. He never returned to the night watchman job. He was 67 years old. He was sitting in a dark building for $40 because he needed the money. And someone put a fire under him. The question of whether Caleb Morrow knew Chester Price was in that building is one that the investigation spent considerable time on, and that the eventual legal proceedings addressed directly. The evidence suggests, and Caleb's own later account confirms, that he did not know. He had surveyed the exterior of the property twice in the preceding week. He had noted no vehicle, no light, no indication of a human presence on those nights. He did not know. Chester Price's lungs did not know that. The investigation begins. Detective Ray Falcott. Ray Falcott had been with the Hocking County Sheriff's Office for 19 years when the Reedsville arson landed on his desk. He was 51, methodical, the kind of detective who taped printed photographs to corkboards in an era of digital investigation boards because he found that physically arranging information helped him think. His colleagues called him the librarian, which is the kind of nickname that is intended as mild mockery and ends up being a form of respect. He began pulling at the threads of the Reedsville fire alongside the state fire marshal. 3 weeks in, a pattern emerged. The arson was not an isolated incident. It connected, through method and geography and a handful of shared behavioral signatures, to a string of property crimes going back 11 months across 3 counties. Different victims, different types of crime, but the same underlying logic. Identified targets, timed operations, minimal physical trace. Someone was doing reconnaissance. Someone was gathering intelligence on these targets before the incidents occurred. The actual perpetrators were leaving almost no forensic evidence, which meant either they were sophisticated, or they were being directed by someone who was. Falcott put up his corkboard. He put up the photograph. He started building the web. He did not yet have Caleb's name. He had not yet understood that the reconnaissance, the architectural intelligence at the heart of the operation, was coming from a child. That understanding arrived the way things like this sometimes do, not through sophisticated detective work, but because a 12-year-old made one small mistake. Alright, very quickly, this episode is brought to you by Uncanny Crime Stories and my humble self, and I'll keep this short because I genuinely cannot wait to tell you about the one small mistake, because it is exactly the kind of thing that makes you understand how fragile a secret actually is. Okay, one small mistake. Here it is. On a Tuesday in March, a gas station attendant named Patrice Owens in the town of Shelby Crossing, which sits between Cartmel and Reedsville, almost exactly on the geographic midpoint of the operations range, found a folded piece of paper wedged under the display rack of the station's small convenience section. She assumed it was litter and almost threw it away. It was a receipt from that same gas station, from a purchase made 4 days earlier. A bottle of water and a pack of gum, total $2.47, paid in cash. On the back of the receipt, someone had written, in small neat handwriting, a list of abbreviated notes. They looked like shorthand, 3 locations, some letters that meant nothing obvious, a series of numbers. Patrice Owens, who was 44 and paid attention to things, had been following the news about the Reedsville arson. She didn't know what the notes meant, but she knew that something that looked like a coded list of locations, found near the midpoint of a multi-county crime wave, might be worth a phone call. She called the Hocking County Sheriff's Office. She got through to Ray Falcott. Falcott drove to Shelby Crossing the same afternoon. He looked at the receipt. He looked at the handwriting, small, neat, precise. He looked at the abbreviations, which he could partially decode because they matched the nomenclature he'd been developing for the property crime locations on his board. He asked Patrice for the station's CCTV footage from the 4 days prior. On the footage from the relevant afternoon, he found a child. A boy, approximately 11 or 12, on a bicycle. He came in, bought a water and gum, stood at the counter for a moment, and left. Clear as daylight. Falcott watched it 3 times. Then he went back to his office and sat down in front of his corkboard and began, very quietly, rearranging his understanding of everything. Identifying Caleb. Cross-referencing the gas station footage with school records from the 3 towns in the operational range took Falcott's office 4 days. There were 41 boys between the ages of 10 and 13 in the immediate area. The gas station footage was clear enough for a reasonable physical comparison, but not definitive. What closed the gap was a second camera, a private residential camera on a house 2 streets from the gas station, that had captured the same boy cycling in the direction of Birchwood Lane. The footage angle included a partial view of the bike, a dark blue BMX with a distinctive yellow reflector tape on the rear fender. An unusual modification. A school resource officer in Cartmel identified the bike. He'd seen it dozens of times. It belonged to a kid named Caleb. Quiet boy. Lived on Birchwood Lane. Ray Falcott pulled Caleb Morrow's record. School photo in the file. Blue background. Slightly lopsided tie. He sat very still for a moment. Then he picked up the phone. The surveillance phase. Watching Caleb without Diane knowing. Here is where the investigation became genuinely unprecedented in Falcott's 19-year career, and where the procedural and ethical complexity began multiplying in ways the Hocking County Sheriff's Office was not entirely prepared for. You cannot simply arrest a 12-year-old on the strength of gas station footage and a receipt with shorthand note. You need to build the case. You need to establish the connection between the child and the adult perpetrators. You need, in a case involving a minor, to satisfy a higher evidential threshold before proceeding, because the consequences of getting it wrong fall harder on a child than on an adult. So Falcott's team watched. For 3 weeks, they ran a surveillance operation on Caleb Morrow, on his movements, on his phone activity, on the comings and goings at the rec house, while Diane Morrow went to work every morning at 5:45, came home every afternoon at 4:30, and cooked dinner in her kitchen on Birchwood Lane with no idea that her son was being watched by federal investigators. No idea that when she called out Caleb, "Dinner's ready," and he came down the stairs in his socks and sat across from her at the kitchen table and ate pasta and talked about his day, a carefully edited version of his day, the part she was allowed to know, that his movements were being mapped, his phone was being triangulated, and the case against him was thickening with every hour. No idea at all. What the surveillance found. Over 3 weeks, the surveillance operation documented the following. Caleb made contact with Tyler Reck on 7 occasions. 3 of those contacts were in person at the Reck property. 4 were via the prepaid phone, which investigators had by now identified and were monitoring with a court order. On 2 nights during the surveillance period, Caleb left the house after 11 p.m., retrieved his bicycle from behind the garden shed where he stored it separately from his regular bike, and cycled routes that investigators were able to map. On the first night, he went as far as the Reedsville Township line and came back. On the second night, he met Tyler Reck at a car park on the edge of Cartmel, was handed a package, and returned home. On both nights, Diane's bedroom light went off at 10:15. She did not hear him leave. She did not hear him return. The package was later identified as containing materials consistent with the incendiary devices used in 3 of the 17 documented incidents. Caleb stored it in the same wardrobe where the prepaid phone lived, behind the same loose section of baseboard. He was 12 years old. He was sleeping 8 feet from evidence that connected him to serious felonies. His mother was in the next room. I've covered a lot of cases on this channel. I've sat in front of this camera and told you about fraudsters and fugitives and investigations that went wrong in ways that took years to fix. This one is different. I'm going to be honest with you about that. Because there's a woman in this story who did nothing wrong. Who worked hard and loved her child and paid attention and still had no idea. And that is not a comfortable thing to sit with, for any of us who have ever trusted someone or been trusted by someone. It suggests something about the limits of what we can know about the people we are closest to. And I find that genuinely unsettling in a way that I don't think a little discomfort acknowledgement would hurt us to sit with for a second. Okay. The moment everything ended. Let's do this. Wednesday, April 9th, 8:17 a.m. It was a Wednesday. Diane Morrow had left for work at 5:40. She was back by 8 because she was covering a half shift that morning. A colleague was sick, the schedule was shuffled, she'd come home to eat before heading to a second site across town. Caleb was at school. He'd left at 7:50. She'd watched him go. She was standing in the kitchen in her nurse's uniform, eating toast over the sink. The specific practiced efficiency of a woman who eats quickly because there is always something next, when she heard the knock at the door. 2 detectives, plain clothes, identification held up, the words Hocking County Sheriff's Office, and could we come in? Diane Morrow would later tell investigators that her first thought, her absolute first, immediate, reflexive thought, was that something had happened to Caleb, that there had been an accident, that he was hurt. She stepped back to let them in with the specific dread of a parent who has been bracing, unconsciously, for that knock their entire parenting life. They sat in her living room. Ray Falcott and a colleague, Detective Susan Achevy. They were careful. They were, by every account, humane. Ray Falcott had a daughter. He had thought about this conversation on the drive to Birchwood Lane. He told her that her son was not hurt. That was the first thing he said, before anything else. Then he told her why they were there. The conversation, what Diane said and what she couldn't say. What followed, in that living room on Birchwood Lane, with Diane Morrow's half-eaten toast still on the kitchen counter, lasted 45 minutes. Falcott laid out, carefully and sequentially, what the investigation had established. The gas station footage, the receipt, the surveillance, the prepaid phone, the meetings with Tyler Reck, the 2 nights Caleb had left the house while she slept. Diane did not speak for long stretches of this. Falcott noticed, and noted in his report, that she did not cry. Not then. She listened with the focused stillness of a person whose mind is working very fast on something it is not equipped for, trying to rebuild a map of the last 2 years against an entirely new set of coordinates. At some point she said, "You're telling me this is my son." Not a question, exactly. Something between a question and a statement. The specific grammatical form of a person checking whether reality is actually real. Falcott said yes. She said, "He's 12. Falcott said he knew. She asked if she could call her sister. Falcott said of course. She picked up the phone. She put it back down. She looked at the wall for a moment. Then she said, very quietly, "Where is he right now?" Falcott said he was in school. He said that school officials were being contacted simultaneously. He said that they had a protocol for this, and that Caleb would be safe. Diane Morrow nodded once. Then she put her hands flat on her knees and sat very still and did not say anything else for approximately 90 seconds. Falcott would remember those 90 seconds for a long time. Caleb is taken from school. At 8:47 a.m., Caleb Morrow was called out of his second period science class by the school principal. 2 detectives were waiting in the main office. A juvenile liaison officer was present as required by Ohio law. His teacher, later interviewed, said he had seemed, as she put it, not surprised. Not the way kids usually are when something happens. He was very quiet. He picked up his backpack very carefully and he went. He was 12 years old. He said nothing in the car on the way to the Hocking County Juvenile Services building. He asked once, very quietly, whether his mother knew. The detective told him yes. He looked out the window for the rest of the journey. The search of Birchwood Lane. While Caleb was in transit, A search team entered the house on Birchwood Lane with a warrant. Diane sat in her own kitchen with Detective Achebe while strangers moved through her home. They found the prepaid phone behind the baseboard in the wardrobe. They found the notebook, the handwritten intelligence logs, months of target surveillance, the shorthand that took 2 weeks to decode. They found the envelope under the desk drawer with $392 in it. They found, in a sealed freezer bag taped behind the wardrobe's back panel, photographs of property locations, taken on what appeared to be a cheap digital camera, printed on regular paper. Cartmill, Shelby Crossing, Reedsville. Some of the images Diane recognized. The Reedsville warehouse. She would have seen it on the news after the fire. She had not recognized it then. She had not made the connection. Why would she have? She sat in her kitchen and listened to the sounds of the search team moving through her son's room. At some point Detective Achebe put a cup of tea in front of her. Diane looked at it. She did not drink it. She said to Achebe, "I knew something wasn't right. I knew something was off this year, I could feel it. I thought it was the divorce coming back up. I thought I thought he needed space." She paused. Then she said, "I gave him the space." Tyler Reck, arrested that afternoon. Tyler Reck was arrested at the house 3 doors down from Birchwood Lane at 2:15 p.m. the same Wednesday. He did not go quietly. He told the arresting officers it was harassment, that they had nothing, that any kid could have found that receipt. When they told him about the phone records, the full transcript of every communication between his number and the prepaid device for the preceding 8 months, he stopped talking. Marcus Webb was picked up in Columbus that evening. Dean Fulcher surrendered through a lawyer the following morning. The network was done. What happens to a 12-year-old who is charged with crimes of this severity in the state of Ohio in 2016 is a question that the juvenile justice system is genuinely not designed to answer cleanly. Caleb Morrow was charged under the Ohio Juvenile Code with 4 counts of complicity to commit aggravated burglary, 2 counts related to the arson in Reedsville, and 1 count of complicity to commit arson resulting in serious physical harm, connected to Chester Price. The prosecution sought, initially, to have him tried as an adult. The juvenile court declined. He remained in the juvenile system. He was placed in a juvenile residential facility for assessment for 90 days. The psychologist's report, portions of which were included in the court record, described a child of high cognitive ability, significant emotional detachment from consequences, and what the report called a sophisticated capacity for compartmentalization atypical for his developmental stage. The report also described a child who, in interview, cried when asked about Chester Price. Not performatively, not in a way designed to produce sympathy. Just, quietly looking at the table, and then stopping and being quiet again. He was sentenced to an indeterminate juvenile placement, a secure residential program, until the age of 18, subject to periodic review. He received mandatory counseling. He was placed in educational programs throughout. He has not been in the public record since. Tyler Reck. Tyler Reck pled guilty to 3 counts of arson, 4 counts of aggravated burglary, and 1 count of conspiracy. He received 11 years. He is currently incarcerated. He has given no public statement about Caleb Morrow or about his role in what happened to him. Ohio law does not provide a specific charge for adults who exploit minors in the facilitation of crimes, for the particular act of identifying a child and systematically engineering their participation in criminal activity. Prosecutors noted this gap in pre-sentencing document. It remains a gap. Chester Price. Chester Price, the night watchman who was found in the south corner of the Reedsville warehouse, was 68 years old at the time of the sentencing. He attended no proceedings. His daughter submitted a written statement. He lives in Reedsville. He cannot work. He uses supplemental oxygen some night. He has said publicly that he does not want people to pray for him. He wants people to consider why a 67-year-old man with a chest condition was sitting alone in an unsprinklered warehouse for $40 a night in the first place. He is not wrong. Diane Morrow. Diane Morrow continued working as a home care nurse in Cartmel. She moved from Birchwood Lane 18 months after Caleb's placement. The house had become, she told a journalist from the Columbus Dispatch, a place I couldn't be in anymore. She has visited Caleb throughout his placement. She has not spoken publicly about the case in detail. The one thing she said on record, to that same Columbus Dispatch journalist, was this: "He is still my son. What he did was real and it was serious, and I am not pretending otherwise. And he is still my son." I don't think those two things cancel each other out. I think you have to hold them both. I have been thinking about that sentence since I first read it. What the investigation left open. When Ray Falcott closed the Birchwood Network file, as much as any file gets closed, he put one note in the summary: a procedural observation. Not a finding, not an allegation. An observation. He wrote, "Subject's operational knowledge of property security systems and law enforcement response protocols exceeded what could be attributed to independent learning or exposure through the REC network. Recommend further inquiry into subject's access to information sources not yet identified in this investigation." That recommendation was noted. A follow-up inquiry was opened. What it found, or whether it found anything, has never been fully disclosed. Caleb Morrow was 12 years old. He grew up on Birchwood Lane. He had a laptop for homework and a loving mother who worked the early shift. And somewhere, in the gap between all of those ordinary things, he learned something that even his investigators couldn't fully account for. I don't know what's in that follow-up inquiry. Nobody who isn't in that system does. But investigators. That is exactly the question I will be looking at in Part 2. This was not an easy episode. I know that. You watched something complicated and uncomfortable today, and you watched it all the way through, and that says something about who you are. If this story raised questions for you about the juvenile justice system, about exploitation of children by adult criminals, or about the support available to families in Diane's position, I've put links in the description. I would encourage you to look at them. As always, find us at Uncanny Crime Stories on all platforms. Share the episode if it moved you. And remember, the most important cases are not always the most famous ones. Sometimes they're a boy on a bicycle in the dark on a rural Ohio road, and a mother who never heard him leave. This has been Uncanny Crime Stories. I'm James. Stay on the trail.